I got a lot of clients who play football and rugby, and these guys, their profiles do look great when we look at their blood pressure and we look at, triglyceride to HDL and some of these biomarkers. The question is always, well, after retirement, you know, this is where we get into trouble. And so on a couple fronts, the first is when we're looking at just what you described here, obviously weight loss is still going to be a key part of this whole story, no?
Yeah, for sure. And, I love the example of the offensive and defensive linemen or some of these other sports where you need a higher weight to be really competitive in it. Because one of the things that happens when they're still active athletes is their exercise is super high, right?
Yeah.
Like you're 3 hours a day sometimes, these guys are going.
And
And what
muscle
that
mass too,
does,
right?
oh yeah, just profound muscle mass because they're working out all the time, they're keeping that. And it just creates this really protective environment so that they don't have those negative biomarkers. And I mean, you hit it right on the head, right? Okay, but then they have retirement. And so then all of a sudden you have this situation where you don't have that intensive exercise. And even if you adjust your diet, right? Even if you adjust your diet and you maintain your weight so you're not gaining too much weight, or maybe you even lose a little weight, that activity is just plummeted. And that's where you can get into this risky area where now maybe you're going to develop that more unhealthy phenotype. And the reason we believe that would happen is because of that underlying concern with just having that excess adiposity that, Kristen Hottie and Dr. Kerwin and myself and others defined in that pretty recent, what was that? 2019, 2020, maybe. I think it actually just came out. 2021 even. We've been working on it for a while now. I can't remember when we actually put it out there, but that's the core concept, right? So like the general thought, I think if you look at the leaders in the field on defining these healthy and unhealthy obesity phenotypes, the general thought is that the metabolically healthy obesity phenotype is transient and it's temporary. And you can only maintain that for so long if you have good activity, if you have a stellar diet, and if you're really doing everything for optimal health. And so once you lose something like activity, or once your diet shifts and maybe you have a lot more saturated fat, right, or added sugar, all of a sudden those other factors that are really potentially damaging long term tend to creep up.
Yeah, it seems like it's buying us some time to be fit and to have these good biomarkers if you are obese and in that healthy phenotype. But as you're saying, we still need to make some changes down the road to be able to achieve that weight that we're after. And this is something that I'd love to get your opinion on. Recently had Prof. Paul Larson on, in this term overfat versus obese. We obviously have, especially when we get to different somatotypes and more of the endomorph type, or we're talking lineman or that type as well. That conversation around just the actual fatness being the problem versus the weight. And curious in terms of your thoughts on how we describe these things. Obviously we classify things in terms of obesity, but where's that on the scale in terms of overfatness, obesity, and how might that play into this whole story?
Yeah. So the funny thing with obesity is the way we define it is by a simple metric, BMI, right? And it doesn't take into account anything you mentioned. And I won't go too deep into that because I'm sure you guys talked about it on other podcasts. But my general thought is that where you store fat matters, right? It matters for your metabolic health. Some fat storage areas seem to be protective. We talk about like subcutaneous fat, sort of more on the peripheral of the body. That seems to be protective to excess eating, right? And then you have the visceral fat, and that seems to be damaging, right? And so if you're having fat around your organs, that's not protective, but that grows and that causes more metabolic issues than if the other type of fat grows. And then there's the where do you store your fat? And does that matter? And we know, the apple versus pear sort of deal,
Yeah.
and differences in cardiometabolic risk. So I think those all play a major factor in defining that sort of metabolically healthy obesity phenotype. Like if you found people that had subcutaneous pear-shaped body shapes, I think they would probably be in that metabolically healthy range for a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to guess, the underlying insulin resistance is probably still going to be there, and it's probably going to catch up to you eventually. So I think it can play a role up to a point. And some of that is also like the amount of excess body weight too, right? So
Yeah.
like we know that, if you look at the mortality curves, I don't know if you guys have talked about that on this before, but there's like a mortality and BMI, right? X and Y axis. And at a really low BMI, your mortality is high, right? If you're super, super thin. And then you get to a certain range and there's a bottom point, right? And that's the healthiest BMI. And then it goes up from there. And that healthiest point is usually in the like mid-low 20s, like 23-ish. So that's technically like just under that overweight category. So there's something a little protective to having some fat on your body. And then for different populations, for example, older individuals, that J-shaped curve is right shifted. So there's more protection for having a little extra body weight. So there's just such a huge complexity around, okay, where is the healthiest amount of fat and what type is it? So it's a really awesome area that, man, I think we still have a lot to learn on exactly what's best.
Yeah, you just nailed it with the context really driving everything, isn't it? I mean, who is it in this scenario? What age are they? Are they an older population? Because obviously muscle loss and sarcopenia then becomes a huge problem. So having some extra weight can actually help with that. If we circle back to the strategies someone might use then, so metabolically healthy obese, deciding, okay, I want to, reduce fat mass to improve this outcome, or that retired player who's deciding, okay, I'm weighing 330 pounds at 6 foot. I need to lose some fat mass. And if we stay on the idea that this underlying insulin resistance, and of course, everyone, we like to pit different dietary strategies against one another. And we know that, the rules of the game for weight loss are similar amongst all of them. But when it comes to insulin resistance, there's a little bit of nuance between the lower carb and lower fat. So I don't know if you could explore that for listeners and viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I'll say, in terms of like what the optimal goal would be for, like, let's say one of those pro athletes that was an offensive lineman, certainly manipulating diet, manipulating exercise can be helpful. But the number one thing I would still say is you got to lose that weight. And some people have done it really successfully. I'm sure you've seen Michael Strahan is everywhere now. Joe Thomas is really emerging on the scene.
Joe Thomas is seeing before and afters of him is pretty striking.
Yeah. And I'm a Cleveland guy. So I was born and raised in Cleveland. So I've been watching Joe Thomas, since he was drafted.
Yeah.
In my mind, one of the best offensive tackles of all time, for sure. I mean, Hall of Famer, number 73, just knocking that in for everybody that's not familiar with him, because he's awesome.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
he was huge. He was a 300-pound guy, and he's got to be 250-ish now. And he's got a great physique. And it happened almost instantaneously. He retired and then just boom. And that's really the healthiest way to do it, is you don't need that excess weight anymore. Get it off. Easier said than done, right? Like I want to be really clear.
Simple, but not easy.
Yeah.
Simple, but not easy.
Absolutely. So in terms of the differences between the diets, I mean, my goodness, I've done research in ketogenesis and the potential role that can play in insulin sensitivity. And it's such a weird dynamic. I think right now there's a big popularity for the really low carb, purely ketogenic approach compared to what I would consider a more traditional approach, which is something that stylistically looks more like the DASH or Mediterranean diets.
Yep.
And I'm assuming those are common enough now that I don't need to necessarily describe them.
Yeah.
But it's essentially high fruit, high vegetable, like lean proteins, right? If you just kind of think about it that way. And so it tends to also be a little higher on the carbohydrate end. Both of those can be effective for weight loss if the calorie range is right. One of the issues with the ketogenic diet is if you don't have something like poor blood glucose, like we see in individuals with diabetes, and you go on this ketogenic diet, and then you were to take some of the tests they do for diabetes, like an oral glucose tolerance test or the clamp that we do, your measures will be worse than if you had a carbohydrate diet. And so that's, really kind of weird, because if you take the opposite of that and you look at what they do in some of the clinical trials, like Verta Health trial was a great one where they took individuals that had obesity and a lot of them had diabetes, and they put them on a ketogenic diet, and they were like, hey man, we had them lose weight, their blood sugars improved, their A1Cs, and these were dramatic improvements. People were coming off medications, and it was like, whoa. So I think there's a difference in terms of the immediate impact you get when you're someone that has issues with blood sugar control and really minimizing the intake of dietary carbohydrates, that eventually turn into sugar, has in my mind, a really different, powerful, positive effect than if you're otherwise healthy, going on a ketogenic diet. It doesn't have that same pronounced benefit. So, having that potential temporary impairment of glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity, I don't see the benefit in an otherwise healthy person as much as I do in someone that is concerned about those risk factors. And I will say, I don't want to make it too crazy, but when you go on the ketogenic diet, and I mentioned if you're healthy, these other markers are worse than they would be. That's temporary. If you go back on the carbohydrate diet, it all comes back. But it's a really cool dynamic to think about in terms of selecting a specific diet for a specific person and what's the best benefit they're going to get out of it.